All right. Welcome, everybody. This is Cloud Provider vSphere monthly meeting. We moved this meeting to a monthly schedule, given that there's less work happening in Cloud Provider for this quarter. The agenda is in the chat. Please add your name to the list. We do have a couple of items on the agenda, but then we'll open up for discussion later because I think there's a couple of things we want to discuss based on discussion before the meeting started. So first thing on the agenda is actually housekeeping items. We do have this meeting now showing up once a month, and due to the fact that it's tied to UTC time zone, it actually shifts back an hour for everybody. So then this brings this into the 8 a.m. time slot for people in the Pacific Coast, which is a bit unfortunate for most of the folks there. So we decided to move this back to 9 a.m. Pacific. So I'll send out the change in the community calendar and in the meeting list to reflect that change. And the same thing will happen for SIG VMware tomorrow, which is now showing the community calendar as 10 a.m. Pacific. We're going to move that back to 11 a.m. as it was before. And that's all for the housekeeping items. Let's talk about the our items on the agenda. So we had a breaking change introduced yesterday, and it's all going back to the configuration file. So when we started working on the AutoTree cloud provider, we basically took the old configuration file from Intree as it is. So all the configuration sections were brought in as they were used in Intree, but the fact that Intree was actually used by the cloud provider and the storage, the volume provider, means that there are some parameters that were not actually used by the cloud provider. So during a cleanup, one of the parameters, or one of the sections was removed, the network section, that had only one parameter under it. The problem is that if you had a config map that included that section, given that the structure doesn't have that field anymore, parsing will fail and the CCM will not start. This caused some problems during end-to-end, and Andrew had a failure during a demo, which was very unfortunate. So I sent a PR yesterday, like a quick fix to bring that back and send add a deprecation notice to the parsing function. We basically just sent out a warning message saying that the network section is deprecated. But this brings up a more like broad topic of the fact that right now it's being used and it's no longer just in development. So we should be more aware when we introduce breaking changes. We should be handling those changes gracefully and deprecating them instead of just removing support altogether and just adding a node in the PR, which is fine if you're working on churning on the initial code base. But right now we're sending out signal to Kubernetes for end-to-end tests. So it's much better if we handle all these changes in a more graceful way, and it's better as a practice, regardless of the fact that we're breaking changes.
Yeah, let me if you don't mind, say something to that. I really appreciate that quick fix. Yeah, it was a demo to SIG testing when it broke. Luckily, it breaks early enough in the process that no signal ever gets reported. So that was good. We didn't have any tests go flaky because of it, because it wasn't even able to stand up the cluster. The issue about which I'm concerned, or I get it from a very I'm very particular. I want things to be as minimal as possible, and so when something is no longer needed, I want to trim it off. But I have to ask, what's the harm in simply ignoring fields that we don't use? Like why error out? And I know you put that fix it, but I'm talking about in the future. Let's say we no longer use something. What I would expect to happen would be, okay, we decide we no longer use a field called networking, for example, and it gets deprecated. So now a warning starts to occur. And then the subsequent release, we don't throw an exception. We simply don't print the warning anymore and we ignore it. And if somebody has a question about it, we can say, well, look, you received a deprecation notice for a couple of months and now it's no longer being used. And maybe their system continues to work, but it's like when you parse, it's like Go's JSON parser, right? If something's not defined, it just ignores it. It's as part of the object model. I'm wondering, is there a particular reason we don't do that?
I think it all comes back to the GCFG library that we're using. We're using this package to parse the configuration file, and it's like like a Windows type of configuration file with sections between brackets, and then you have parameters equals something, key equals value,
I'd have to
and
take a look at it, but I wonder if there's not a way to say like ignore unknown fields.
I've looked briefly on this specific issue months back when I started working on the auto tree code base, and there was no straightforward way to do it. So if the field was not present in the struct you were trying to parse the file into, then it will just fail, which was kind of very hard way to to approach this problem. There was no like parameter to like permit this field to be empty or permit this section to be empty,
Yeah.
like there is in like when, for example, in the XML package, if you want to
So
limit the field.
would you be opposed to a PR that, moving forward, there's no real reason we have to continue to use this config format. So maybe we even introduce a new flag, or moving forward, we first try to parse that value as JSON or YAML, and if successfully parsing, it uses the new format, and if not, it defaults back to the GCFG. And I'm wondering, maybe there's no reason that we need to continue to use that format since we're no longer tied to entry. And it will still support it, but this way it can support a newer format moving forward that's more flexible.
I'm 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 not against changing it, but I would strongly prefer to keep the same format, not necessarily keeping the same package to do the formatting, to do the parsing of the file.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No, I understand. The only reason I suggested a different format is in that I know that the others would not panic on a um, undefined value. That's it. But
I think
yeah, I
that's
mean,
more.
maybe we can even fork this library and
Mm,
add that feature to it to ignore unknown fields.
or maybe there's even a better library. I don't know. I haven't actually looked at that, but there's a good chance that there's another library that is more flexible in doing the parsing instead of just failing if there's a even if there's um, like a field that has nothing to do with the configuration. Maybe a comment is parsed, but if there's like a malformatted something in there and it just fails because there's a line that it cannot be parsed, it doesn't feel like a good way to handle errors or problems in the configuration file. So I think searching for a better library or just forking that and making changes there if the library is simple enough. I think
So
it's
there actually is a way to do it. I pasted it into the chat. I'll paste the link here. Like you can ignore extra data warnings by wrap. It's basically a try catch and go. Essentially, they're like, oh yeah, just ignore these types of errors. So it's still errors. We just ignore it. So maybe something we can look at and play around with that.
yeah. I mean, I'm totally open in making the parsing more relaxed than it is right now. Um, I think still we'll have to handle deprecation notice by hand. when the parsing happens. But yeah, I mean, by all means, if we can change the default behavior of the library and make sure that whenever we do parsing, if we parse something that is not shouldn't be there, we don't just fail, and we just keep going with whatever parameters we have. I think it's fine.
And
I will be glad to have it.
cool. And I would argue it could be a case by case basis. In this particular instance, we never used the field, so we should have not errored out on it. But I can see where there might be fields that or get renamed or whatever that absolutely like this matters. But then that raises the question. I just discovered provides the data about the field that caused the error, so it may not be something that we can decide on a case by case basis. So yeah, I mean, you and I could take a look at it offline, but I really do appreciate you getting that fixed in so quickly. And it does rate, and I don't know if this is part of the meeting. You know, the reason this happened during the demo is because Yakety is using latest for the image. We don't have any tagged releases yet. And so are we going to address that on this call, perhaps?
Yeah, that's actually the second part of the of the agenda. Starting to do some tag release for the CCM, and just to close on the configuration file, I think configuration parsing is even more important right now because we're adding a CSI driver in the same repo, and the CSI driver is sharing a lot of code with the CCM, including the configuration parsing. All the methods and all the packages will be shared, same as the config map that is basically the manifestation of the configuration for CCM and CSI. So there's probably a lot of more parameters that have to be added. The more features we support, the more parameters we need in the configuration file. So it's very important that the configuration methods, the configuration parsing methods are, as solid as possible.
You keep saying config map, and maybe I misunderstand that, but config maps really represent like files on disk, and I suppose they could represent just a key value pair, but you mean specifically the config file, right?
Yeah, that's the config file. I just say config maps because we started using config maps for that.
I had suggested on our internal Slack the other day that in the absence of a config file, maybe with secrets or some type of key value representation, when there's only a single vCenter, maybe we could also just check for a few keys and say, oh, they don't need the whole file. Here's just here's the vCenter name, and then whatever the required values are. Maybe you can even simplify it further, but I'm going to take that offline.
Yeah, I think I think the typical use case for this configuration file is to be filled with everything you need to run to properly run the CCM and the CSI plugin.
Oh, that's true. I didn't consider it being both, but you're right. You're right.
So I think that will be the typical use case, and I will be happy to have those packages as solid as possible when it comes to parsing that configuration file and make sure that they don't error out if there's something bogus in it. But I think that is the main focus for those packages. Make sure that we parse those configuration files as as solidly as possible.
Gotcha.
Going to the next item, which is start tagging. We haven't established any policies on this. So right now, I think what is in the repo can be considered still an alpha version, maybe a beta version. I'm open to suggestions here, and I don't know if we want to follow the same, a simplified version of what Kubernetes does for releasing a new version. So creating a a release branch and start, cherry picking comments there. I don't know.
So what I would suggest is we follow Git flow and do an annotated tag with a alpha suffix. So I don't know what our first release number is going to be, if it's going to be 1.0 or 0.10 or whatever. But basically what we would do is just write on master, because it's still a single branch of development right now. Mm-hmm. Right on master, we would do an annotated tag and say it's 1.0, and it would be v1.0.0 dash alpha 1 or whatever we decide there. And then using git describe, if you're familiar with it, right? If you do an annotated tag and then immediately type git describe, you're going to get the annotated tag back. If you do an annotated tag and now there are 5 more commits and do git describe, it's going to be the annotated tag plus 5 and then the current commit. So it'll tell you how many commits there have been since the last tagged version. And that's how GitHub handles versions. All the releases you see are annotated tags on GitHub. So that would at least mark something as, okay, this is our alpha 0 release or whatever. And then at least our, for purposes of different things, we could rely on that. And then at that point, git describe would actually start working, because until you have an initial annotated tag, you can't use git describe. But then the output of it is very, very friendly and useful for things like Docker or image tags.
Yeah, and we should start also bringing, this information into the CCM code as well. I don't think we have any versioning right now. Printing out.
We do, remember, because it changes the binary every time. When it's being built, that uses a compiler value or uses a compiler flag to inject the current hash or some version of it into because remember we were trying to figure out why the SHA-SUM of the binary changed every time it was built, is because it's injecting the current hash into the binary that's being built.
You're right. Yeah. Doug, this is the same way we're doing releases for GoVMommy, right? GoVC.
Yeah, it's annotated tag, and then we use git describe to.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a solid way to start. I mean, right now, I don't think we have any, special, case that requires something, more complex than just adding tags to master. So I think we'll start with that. And
Yeah,
see
don't over engineer it. And I mean, until right now, if we did a release branch, what good is that, right? People are still going to be, until we get to a 1.0, we're all committing to master. So, and honestly, it probably wouldn't have helped me much yesterday during the demo, because right now we should be testing off of master. So, I mean, it was good that it broke, good that we caught it, just unfortunate when it happened. But moving forward, they raised this topic in SIG testing, actually, and so I meant to raise it here, and then our meetings went monthly. They were concerned that we're only testing head everything except for Kubernetes, and maybe they're testing more than the head version of their providers internally. Ben from Google raised this issue. Certainly, it's not reflected on the test grid, but I've raised this issue before. Fabio, you've raised it. We're all aware of it. But the moment that we start having tagged versions, we need to consider, even if we don't push the results, setting up tests for those versions against different versions of Kubernetes. I don't think it's a real big issue until we get to 1.0, but at that point, we're going to want to start testing that 1.0 release against all of the sliding versions of Kubernetes like we do now for head of the CCM.
Yeah. This topic has been brought up a few times already. I think we should start somewhere, right? And after we start tagging and we have the first tag out, we should maybe start. I will say that if we follow the same principle as Kubernetes and we test, I think it's -2 versions that they provide usually support for -2 versions.
That's what we're doing right now. That's how we're testing.
And we add the version of the CCM as another dimension to the matrix.
Yeah.
And we keep it that way. And then we eventually will figure out if we want to add the third one, which is the vSphere version.
Yeah. So when we get that first annotated tag, let's do a breakout, and other people are welcome to join, but I'll prep something for the Travis config, and then we could implement it. Basically, to be a cron job, because at that point, there's no reason that it has to be a cron job. We'll run it once a day, although they even want it more frequent than that, but we can't do it. We can run it once a day against the same versions of Kubernetes that we're currently running head, but we'll run our alpha release against it. At least that way it's set up. And then we'll basically we'll have those, like you said, -2 configs, and then those things will just slide as we get newer versions.
Yeah. Sounds good.
But I don't know what to do with those results. I think what we'll do, if you're on the phone, you're here, yeah. I think we should probably still push them to the buckets that we're doing, even if the test grid isn't consuming them. That way, those results are there, and so we can connect them to the test grid later if we want, or we can just review them ourselves.
I think this is actually something worth discussing in SIG testing as well, adding more dimensions to the test with version of components being tested. I know that I don't think right now is being supported by test grid, like having version of Kubernetes.
It's not. They support multiple versions of Kubernetes by virtue that it's a flat space. So I mean, what you see here, let me share my screen. We can show you real quick. What you see is this. So VMware, right? Conform its cloud provider, and then you see the different versions of Kubernetes. It's flaky because we had one failure a couple of days ago. But if we wanted multiple versions of the CCM, right, the way that would be reflected is that you would have to have here, dang it, CCM dash version. Yeah. And then for every one of those, you would see but no one's doing that. And so I think that they're probably doing it internally because Ben called that out, that we're not doing it. And I thought, well, you're not doing it there either, but I think it's just not being pushed to the grid, probably. I mean, it wouldn't be difficult to do. It's just, it's more time in Travis that we don't really have the luxury of. So,
yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, let's start pushing them anyway and see if we can come up with a solution on how to present them. But right now, I'm more concerned in running the test and see if they fail or not. At least at least keeping the matrix small for now. We're gonna have just one tag version for the time being. We don't plan on tagging another version, anytime soon. And all the other versions will be tagged not as frequently as, probably going to be tagged as frequent as Kubernetes releases. So I don't anticipate having more than 2-3 tags in 6-9 months from now. So the matrix is going to be quite small anyway. So let's start testing with what we have, and then let's figure it out if there's a better way of running them. I don't know, through Prow or getting rid of Travis at some point. I know you've been working on all this, so.
Yeah, no, I'm working on the ability to stand this up with kubetest right now. So once we have that, we can run out of Prow, and then we can have as many different tests as we want.
Okay, cool. And that's all I have on the agenda. Is there anything else people want to discuss? I mean, we're almost beyond the meeting, but given it's now a monthly schedule, if we run over first time, it's not going to be a problem, unless people have conflicts. Anything else? No. All right, going once, going twice. All right, I see you guys. It's a wrap. Bye.